Now that South Africa has agreed to a new cabinet, what's ahead for its government of national unity? Hello, I'm Nhlanhla Naidu, and this is The Heat. Weeks after the African National Congress failed to win a majority in South Africa's elections, the country's coalition government is up and running. A new cabinet has been sworn in, with most seats going to the ANC. The Democratic Alliance Party holds some key positions. But can this government of national unity work together? And what are some of its biggest priorities and challenges? To weigh in on all of this, joining me from Johannesburg is Mavuso Msimang. The ANC veteran is a former member of its National Executive Committee. Also with us from Cape Town is Sanusha Naidu. She is a Senior Research Associate for Global Dialogue. Joining the discussion too is Nhlanhla Sehume. He is a journalist and news anchor. And also with us is Abdullahi Boru Halakhe. He is an Africa security and policy analyst. Welcome to all of you. Nhlanhla Sehume, let me start with you. Well, we are in the early days of South Africa's new government of national unity. It also includes several parties. South Africans voted for change in that election. They want a government that can deliver on its promises. The new cabinet has been sworn in. We can now put faces to the various portfolios. So what are the priorities for the new government?
Well, the priorities for this new government will be to really work together because, as mentioned in our previous interview, South Africans have really forced these political parties, whether they differ on ideology, to literally work together. So finally, the ball has started rolling after the president announced members of his new cabinet. But of course, this follows protracted negotiations between these political parties, and notably the ANC and the DA, as it would seem that there was a lot of horse trading taking place in the background to decide on what this cabinet will actually look like. So as expected, it was a mixed bag, really, as we saw a number of cabinet positions being announced, some surprises, while some argue that those who are returning, for instance, such as the finance minister, Enoch Godongwana, it has been met with general acceptance, if you will, because it would seem that there's also this need for continuity in some departments that are doing well. And as another vote of confidence, I guess, for the newly formed, or not so newly formed, Ministry of Electricity, which is, of course, led by Dr. Hossein Churamogopa, he returns to that portfolio. But of course, a number of changes also being announced, but I guess we'll get into that later on in this interview.
Right. Mavuso Msimang, great to have you with us. Welcome to the show. Now, with the ANC sharing power with the Democratic Alliance as well as other smaller parties, there are differences in ideology. There are political differences as well. Can they work together? I mean, this is largely uncharted territory for the ANC.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. Yes, they definitely can. There is a precedent, although the situation was different in 1994 when the ANC had won an outright majority. It invited the major party, the National Party, really, which was the apartheid party, to come into a coalition, to a government of national unity with it. And it worked to some extent, but within a short time it had dissipated, not because the ANC asked anybody to go, but I think the changing times and changing expectations caused the National Party of the former apartheid premier, F.W. de Klerk, to dissolve, at least to exit the government of national unity. The situation is different now. The ANC desperately, absolutely needs a partner in order for it to be able to govern. So it's more compelling for them to recognize the need to forge a relationship that is really sustainable, that is firm, that is fair. It absolutely is what would be required by South Africans. I'm not saying that this is always appreciated by the people. For too long, the ANC has been, for very long, I'm sorry, the ANC has been in government 30 years, and so many people are, it hasn't quite dawned on them that they are no longer a government without the assistance of others.
Sanusha, great to see you. Now, the government in South Africa faces major challenges, and some of those challenges were outlined by President Cyril Ramaphosa in his inauguration address. Let's listen to some of that.
Our society remains deeply unequal and highly polarized. There are toxic cleavages of an incipient social fragmentation that can only turn into instability. The lines drawn by our history and our past, between black and white, between men and women, between suburbs and townships, between urban and rural, between the wealthy and the poor, remain still deeply etched in our landscape.
So, Sanusha, the president there talking about South Africa's past, South Africa's history, it would appear that the legacy of apartheid still looms very large in the country. What are your expectations as it tries to move forward?
Good day, Anand, good day to the fellow panelists. I think the expectations have to be about what are the key policy dynamics and trajectory that we're going to see in this government of national unity. As we are discussing these very important points, I think one of the key issues is now we have ministers, we have a cabinet that has appointed, we have portfolio chairs in parliament that have now also been appointed. The portfolio committees have also been appointed in terms of the members of the National Assembly. But I think it's still very much an issue in terms of how fast this government of national unity is going to take on those issues that the president had mentioned in terms of the social instability, the kind of reflection of the spatial inequality, but the other inequalities that afflict the lives and livelihoods of ordinary South Africans. I think when you listen to his inaugural speech, you can't deny that there's a lot that has not been able to be achieved in terms of where we are after 30 years. But the challenge, I think, is really the expectation of what's going to be the implementation of policy to address those very social dynamics and those inequalities that the president mentions. And one of the key things for me is the policy process that now goes forward. As we speak, the budget speeches are going to be made to Parliament by the various ministers, and that happens from the 11th of July to the 24th of July. That also means that they have to debate, discuss, and then affirm those budget lines, which means that for this year, our budget in terms of those departments have to go forward. And how those budgets are going to go forward is going to be important. Where is going to be the key policy dynamics in addressing what is some of the inherent issues in terms of policy malaise, but also in terms of implementation. We hear a lot about the challenges of what the implementation of policy has been. So I think people's expectations will have to be tempered, because I think the GNU as it sits, there's a lot of internal negotiations that also have to happen, and particularly along the lines of what the statement of intent is and how they arrived to this cabinet of the GNU, but also the tensions that will go forward in terms of are they reaching consensus and are they on the same page when they have that cabinet Lekgotla and they continue to meet as a GNU cabinet.
Mavuso, what are your thoughts on these challenges that Sanusha talks about on the implementation of policies, on the speed with which that is done? Because, you know, as I pointed out at the beginning, this is a new government. It's a coalition government. People are looking for this government to deliver on its promises. How do you see it?
Well, the most important thing really is that there should be commitment. I don't think there is much of a policy difference. It's always been said about the ANC that it's got wonderful policies. That's said even by the opposition. It's just the implementation that has been a problem. I will address the issue of where the differences might be, but even there, I don't think they are really fundamental. We are where we are at 40%. I'm talking as an ANC person, because of our because of our incompetent implementation of very straightforward policies There is no power, or there has been power disruptions, the water supplies, there has been a very poor delivery of services. And over a period of more than 10 years, 15 years, people have been saying, listen, you are employing and deploying people to serve the community who really aren't very competent or not very committed to that. So what needs to be done is to straighten this thing out, make sure that, I think if people are self-confident, there is a likelihood that, well, what would be needed is that people compete with people coming from other parties, mainly the DA, and show that these things can be implemented. The different policy issues, and I think it's a question of statement, understanding, affirmative action, which is called Black economic empowerment here. I don't think there's any sensible person who would disagree that there is a need to do that. The Democratic Alliance talks about it being based on merit. I don't think we need the Democratic Alliance to tell us how badly we have implemented the Black economic empowerment project. It needs to be done properly. Foreign policy, I think there are differences too, but I don't see much else, honestly. All people need to do is put the shoulder to the wheel and move forward.
Okay, Abdullahi, great to have you on the show as well. Now, the ANC will hold the bulk of cabinet seats. The Democratic Alliance, or DA as they're known, they would be getting 6 of the remaining 12 seats. Here is what the leader of the DA, John Steenhuisen, had to say. Let's listen to him.
The sheer weight and spread of these 12 portfolios amount to a recognition that the DA now has a meaningful and vital role to play in the reconstruction of our country.
So, Abdullahi, there have been tensions between the ANC and the DA. There are some who say or express some kind of unease with the fact that the ANC has now gone into a coalition with a party which many see as representing white interests. Could this be an issue going forward?
No, thank you so much. I think all the panelists have spoken about this. I think the reality is ANC has been given another get-out-of-jail card to the extent that they have not been able to deliver the mandate that it's been given. So here again is an opportunity for ANC, because what we have, what we call the government of national unity, really is an elite compact, because the electorate were, dissatisfied with how things are going. So it is not just the challenge of the tension, disagreement between amongst the parties, but also within the party that will be very important, because it is not just at the national level where these problems are, it is also at the subnational level, which for a very long time formed the basis or the backbone of the ANC's support. So if they fail to deliver, again, whether it's because of the DA or other coalition partners, the ANC's majority would be on the chopping board. So to my mind, beyond the grand statements that the president made about this being a new beginning, it is not a new beginning. It is an opportunity for ANC that walks one way, that talks one way, and walks in the other direction. But again, we've got not to forget that South Africans tend to undersell themselves. This is the 7th elections that they've had. There are problems, as are elsewhere, but it is not a problem unique to South Africans. It is a problem that is unique to many of these political parties that come to power after being outside fighting for change. Probably the only remaining political party that is still in power since independence is the Tanzania's African National Unity.
Now, Nhlanhla Sehume, the leader of the Democratic Alliance, John Steenhuisen, is now the Minister of Agriculture, and he says he'll work very hard on behalf of farmers. Now, land reform is a very big issue in South Africa. I should say that there is also a separate minister who's in charge of land reform and development. But how do you see John Steenhuisen put his stamp on his portfolio?
It's very interesting that you bring the name of John Steenhuisen into the hat, because that was one of the notable names that was raised when the president was unveiling his cabinet. But also, it would seem that by offering the leader of the opposition party a cabinet seat, it is also a test, if you will, to the opposition parties to say, look, you've been sitting in the benches all these years, in the opposition benches. Now's the time that you actually show what you can do. So this is also an opportunity for a number of these political parties and their leaders as well, because I must mention, Anand, that John Steenhuisen isn't the only leader of a political party or opposition party who has either been given a ministerial seat or a deputy minister seat. A number of leaders from, for instance, the IFP, Al-Jamaa, their leaders have also been allocated cabinet seats or deputy cabinet seats as well, or deputy ministry seats. So it is, like I mentioned, a mixed bag, if you will, when it comes to who consists or who makes up this cabinet of President Cyril Ramaphosa. But to echo the words of a colleague of mine, it would seem that strong appointments in priority areas also bolster a certain level of optimism, especially when it comes to a policy reform as well. You look at the reappointment of Enoch Godongwana, who I mentioned earlier on when I responded to you, but also, as mentioned, John Steenhuisen. It is a name that many South Africans, yes, were expecting to make up this cabinet, but very interesting that he's been put in the agricultural department, because again, there is this big debate around a land reform and policies around Section 25 of the Constitution, or amending it when it comes to land. So it would seem that the debate still rages on when it comes to when these parties do deliver their manifestos. They do give us a semblance of what they advocate for or what they stand for. So people will be looking at John Steenhuisen and this ministry quite critically in the months and years to come.
Sanusha, let's talk about the opposition in the new parliament. There is one party, the MK party, which was formed by the former President Jacob Zuma. It won a relatively significant part of the vote, 14% of the vote. It is not part of the government of national unity, and it's been making allegations of vote rigging. But what kind of role do you see the MK party play?
Well, I think when you look at the allocation of the members in Parliament in the various portfolio committees, you get the sense that they are going to be using that space that they received in terms of their electoral outcome and the votes that they got, which gives them 58 seats in the National Assembly. And of course, one of those is the fact that their chief whip of the party is the former Judge President of the Western Cape, John Hlophe. Now, that has caused a lot of controversy around whether or not, the fact that he was impeached by the Judicial Service Commission for behavior that wasn't in accordance with his position as the judge president, and perhaps involved in allegations of trying to influence outcomes of members in the judiciary. I mean, he's now the chief whip of the party. And that's also raised questions about, is this something that we have to think about in the context of the fact that the rules of Parliament don't necessarily preclude people who may have been in a situation that we now see that's going to basically be part of a commission or service commission like the JSC that will actually be looking at future judges coming into the judicial system. So that has raised a few questions, but I think that has set the par for what the MK party will be looking at. And I would be interested to also see how this plays out with the EFF as well.
Right. Abdullahi, talking about the EFF, they're on the far left, also on the opposition benches, led by Julius Malema. I mean, they have an agenda which calls for nationalizing key industries and land. What can we expect from the EFF, as they are more commonly known?
EFF has made it very clear, even before the elections, that even before the formation of government of national unity, that they are not going to work with ANC. They gave some, hardline positions that cannot be accommodated. But I think, just like Sanusha has mentioned, I think the parliament is also one area that will come under microscope. Under ANC, it was fairly emasculated and it didn't do its oversight role. Now is the time for the parliament also to be under spotlight, not just parliament, but most oversight institutions it has to cease acting as an appendage to the executive. It needs to cease acting like it's a long feeding trough of a patronage system. And I think Parliament will be one of those. And I think Malema and his people will be trying to play that role of being, really making people uncomfortable. And I think that is not the worst thing in the whole world, because what is required now is not just compromise, it is delivery. If there was one ringing endorsement, if there was one thing that the voters put out was deliver on your promises, and that not only include ANC, but also the oversight role of the parliament, where Malema and his party would also be held to account to avoid the capture of states' institutions.
Mavuso, you've been around the ANC for a long time. What is the future of the party? You know, on a previous occasion, I was talking to Abdullahi, and he was telling us that in many instances, if we look at other countries in Africa, liberation parties, parties that took power after independence, normally had a shelf life of about 2 decades. In South Africa, 3 decades. I mean, do you see a time when the ANC could possibly regain the majority that they used to have in Parliament? Or are we going to see more diversity in Parliament, more coalition governments in the times ahead?
I'm not quite sure what the basis of these thresholds for liberation movements is. I think Frelimo is still around, by the way, and they've been there longer than us. MPLA, much weakened, but they're still in power. So the Tanzanian party was really ravaged. They were seriously, but it's still there and so on. The real problem that's brought the ANC to where it is, to grief, is that it was seen by the people to be rather comfortable with corruption, that it also had many corrupt people among itself and was just not able to get rid of that. The result was not just the diversion of funds to people's pockets and other things that had nothing to do with development, but rather the knowing of institutions, placement of incompetent, unsuitable people. That's really what has caused the crisis. If that can be put into straight, you know, there is a division. You are mentioning the number of parties that have been given cabinet positions. I really think the failure would only happen if there was an attitudinal problem. The problems are really straightforward. There is budget. If you have competent people, it's clear that these things are achievable. I think the biggest challenge will be the ANC accepting that it is working with the other people as partners rather than doing them, say, a favor to bring them into this thing. The ANC is not easily going to go back to the majority that it has had in the past. That is absolutely clear. The 5-year time frame they have between now and the next election is just much too short. People will be looking at how the collective performs and implements commonly agreed programs on what needs to be done.
Okay, and Nhlanhla, let's talk about some of the other major issues that South Africa faces. I mean, you mentioned earlier on energy security, but there's also things like urban renewal, immigration concerns in the country, a relatively high crime rate, and of course the big one, job creation. I mean, are we going to see a new approach now?
I will say that through the interactions I've had with several people I've spoken to, just normal members of the public who I've engaged with, just to get an idea or semblance of where their thoughts are around this government of national unity, it would seem that, well, I know I use a very small sample, but people are generally accepting of this government of national unity and also a bit optimistic for what it may bring. Because to take from Mr. Mavuso Msimang, people are literally fed up with poor service delivery and corruption notably as well. And they do want to see a semblance of change, you know, and to see their communities also being safer, a place where children can play without the risk of possibly having them being kidnapped or even sexually assaulted at times. You know, so it would seem that generally the spirit right now is one where South Africans want to see this cooperation between these different political parties, or 10 political parties working together and ensuring that South Africa does indeed change for the better, a country where we'll see a growing economy, a country where we see jobs also being created, because that is a big challenge right now that especially the youth will be looking at quite closely. Especially those also who voted for change, hoping that things will start happening for the country as well, and that with improved economic growth, that these opportunities will be created, especially for the country's most vulnerable, and that being young people, because they make up the bulk of the country's unemployed.
Sanusha, I've got a little bit of time left. I want to talk about foreign policy. I mean, do you see any major foreign policy changes on the part of the new government? South Africa is, of course, a key member of the BRICS Plus group. It also took a major stand on the Israeli onslaught on Gaza. It brought a genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. It has a new foreign minister right now, Ronald Lamola. How do you see it?
Well, I think listening to the foreign minister and his reaction to the question that he was precisely asked about the foreign policy, I mean, you can see that from a theoretical, from a policy perspective, there's continuity. We're going to continue to see the South African government play that role in terms of the multilateralism, the reform of the international system, the inclusion of those marginalized communities, taking up the kind of international law and the reform of that and the equivalency of international law being applied in a practical way. So all of that we've seen in the last 5 years under the previous minister, Dr. Naledi Pandor, will have a continuity. Tomorrow, I think we'll get a sense when there's a discussion here in Cape Town, and of course the budget speech when he makes to Parliament later on in the day, where we'll see the kind of issues that he would then flag as important in terms of the implementation around the policy direction, and more importantly, I think, understanding our economic engagements. Right now, we know that the U.S. House of Representatives has approved a full review of the U.S.-South Africa relations based on the idea that we may be compromising the national security of the U.S. Now, whether that passes the U.S. Senate will be an issue. But of course, what also matters is what happens in the U.S. Elections, presidential elections. So I think right now we are more or less in a continuity mode, but at the same time, I think we'll have to strengthen our foreign policy in terms of the bureaucratic and the and the engagements.
Abdullahi, very quickly, I've got a few seconds left. I mean, South Africa sees itself as a leading voice on the continent of Africa, if not in the wider developing world. So the new government is going to be watched very closely, especially by other African nations. I mean, what will they be looking for?
I think their position on Sudan will be very important. Their position on the DRC will be very important, because Sudan now is the largest displacement on the continent, and South Africa, especially during the previous administration under Thabo Mbeki, played a significant role for the DRC because the South African has sent their troops in the eastern part of DRC. Those two would be a serious test for South Africa's foreign policy on the continent.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nhlanhla Sehume in Washington, D.C.